hosting ability at that point.
Thank you. I'm going to sign off here then.
All right. See ya.
We're just waiting a second for everybody to join, and then we'll begin here shortly. Brian, I'm going to wait to push it through Facebook until he gets on.
Okay.
You know,
Yeah,
what
for
his
everybody
Zoom-
that's
you know what
joined
his
us
Zoom
so far,
is?
please just give us a minute. We're working on getting our hosts set up here.
Robert, are you in?
I am in and I am on.
There we
Okay,
go.
I couldn't figure out if that was you or not, so that's why I
Right.
waited.
This says host disabled participant screen sharing. So I think you're going to have to give me some kind of co-host status.
There you go.
Okay.
Well, Robert, if you don't mind, I'll do a quick introduction of you before we kind of get rolling.
That's fine. Let me know. I want to give people 2-3 minutes to come on.
Yeah, let's do that because it looks like there's only 5 so far. So we'll give it just a moment. We got a final count of 20 that had registered, so. Well, I'll tell you what, I'll go ahead and do your introduction. We'll get going and people can
Okay.
join as they get on here. So for our guest, Robert Zafft is a Forbes contributor in leadership strategy and the author of The Right Way to Win, Making Business Ethics Work in the Real World, which, by the way, for everybody that can submit a question or actually vocally participates in our conversation today, we're going to send you an e-copy of that book. So please be active, ask questions. This is meant to be an interactive conversation with Robert. He teaches business ethics at the Olin School of Business at Washington University here in St. Louis and serves as a fellow of World Commerce and Contracting, a global business association. He's a Harvard Law School graduate and former McKinsey & Company consultant and serves of counsel with Greensfelder, Hemker, and Gale PC. So Robert, really thank you for being here. I was introduced to Robert through a story he wrote that I read in the St. Louis Business Journal about this topic. And I thought this would be great for him to present to our organization, PRSA St. Louis. So Robert, thank you very much for being here, and I'll turn it over to you to take over.
Thanks very much, Brian. I appreciate it. Welcome to everyone. Thank you for coming on. Today, we're going to talk about how to steer clear of political and social controversies and crossfires. What we'll do first of all is I want to introduce the distinction between a crisis and a crossfire. We'll look at 4 key questions then that I think people need to wrestle with as they're contemplating a looming issue that has come up or something that they're trying to get out of, which is one, do we need to do something? Have we followed the right procedures? What precedent will we set? And should we go it alone? And in each of these, we're going to look at some real world case examples. And then we'll take a quick wrap up by talking about the market for reputation. So crises versus crossfire. You can think of a crisis typically focuses on some wrongdoing by the entity or by people within the entity. And so the question then becomes, was some norm broken? A crossfire, by contrast, typically finds a person or a company caught between contending outside forces. And so let's look at some examples, and you can decide, let me know through the chat feature, we think it's a crisis or a crossfire. So we think about Wells Fargo Bank a few years ago. Wells Fargo found that about 5,300 of its employees in its consumer retail division opened up about 3.5 million phony accounts in the name of hundreds of thousands of customers. Does that sound like a crisis or a crossfire? Let people use the chat function to let me know what their thoughts are. Now, people are saying crisis, and I agree with you, because the issue is, was wrongdoing committed? Was fraud committed? Should senior executives have put in place better systems to catch this? Did they know about it themselves and allow it to go on? Let's take another example. We can think about Aunt Jemima was a brand of pancake mix as well as a brand of pancake syrup. In England, they have renamed one of their national rugby teams has been called the Celtics for many decades. Excuse me, the Saxons. They've been called the Saxons for many decades, and now they've said they're going to change their names. The analogy might be the Washington Redskins of the National Football League has now changed its name to the Washington Football Team. Would that be a crisis or a crossfire? Here again, yes. In fact, the issue there is not that some wrongdoing happened at the time the pancake batter was named, or at least it was not perceived as such. No one is claiming that at the time was grossly offensive to a wide variety of people. Similarly, with the name of the Saxons or the Washington Redskins, what's happened is there are issues in society about branding and about names and about stereotypes. And so older line companies and brands that have been using it for many decades now find themselves caught between contending forces. Goldman Sachs Malaysia had two of its senior people indicted for participating in a scheme to defraud the Malaysian Sovereign Wealth Fund. And Goldman Sachs ended up having to pay $5 billion in reparations and fines. Crisis or crossfire? I would agree that that's a crisis because the issue was the wrongdoing. Let's take another example. After the state of Georgia passed voting law reforms, Major League Baseball pulled its All-Star game in 2021 out of Atlanta and moved it to Denver. Subsequently, Major League Baseball has been sued for $1 billion by various vendors who were impacted by the removal of the game from Atlanta. A crisis or a crossfire? This was initially a crossfire. Nobody thought that Major League Baseball was remiss in booking the All-Star game in 2021 in Atlanta. In removing the game from Atlanta and triggering a lawsuit, it may have also now brought upon a crisis if you consider $1 billion issue to be a large issue. So what you can have is you can have a crossfire which can turn into a crisis. So sometimes you get a mixed bag. In this light, we can think about Target, which a few years ago, in the aftermath of North Carolina passing a law that required people in government buildings to use the lavatory that aligned with their sex at birth or the sex indicated on their state documents, Target announced a gender fluid changing room policy so that you would use at Target stores that changing room or that lavatory which aligned with your gender self-identification. As a result of which, a boycott erupted and Target lost about $10 to $15 billion in market cap. Was that a crisis, a crossfire, or something in between, or a combination? This was a combination. In fact, in this particular case, what happened was there was certainly a crossfire on this issue between the members of the Georgia's legislature who voted for this new legal change and the people who opposed it. And what happened in this case, unlike Major League Baseball, is that Target voluntarily stepped into the crossfire and then made its decision, then precipitated what could be considered a crisis of public relations for a couple of reasons. One was the boycott and the resulting loss of $10 to $15 billion in market cap. In addition, what happened was any altercation in any Target changing room or lavatory became national news for a period of time. So people understand the difference between the crisis and the crossfire very clearly. And then also, I think what we can see is sometimes you get some of both. You get a combination. One can trigger the other. So let's focus on the threshold question. Do we need to do something? And I want to start with a hypothetical of what's my favorite company, Widget Co. And Widget Co. manufactures widgets and provides widget maintenance services. And let's just imagine that there's a sole owner of Widget Co. His name is Bo Widget. He founded it. He grew the company. He did very, very well. And then he goes green. He decides that after taking a salary and some perks like a company car and business class travel when he's traveling for Widget Co., he's going to give the remainder of all Widget Co.'s profits to the Sierra Club, which is an environmental charity. Does anybody see a problem with that? Does that strike anybody in any way as being ethical? Is this ethical or unethical? The fact that he's giving away the company's profits. Okay, this seems pretty clearly the case that although the assets belong to Widget Co., Bo indirectly owns 100% of these assets because he's the sole owner. And so in causing the company to give away all of its profits, he's not exploiting any of the shareholders. So this would not be considered to be unethical. Let's imagine, however, that Bo didn't start the company by himself. He started with a sibling, Billy. He and Billy, the sibling, owned the company 50-50. And at a certain period of time, when Bo goes green, Billy decides that she wants to see company profits given to her favorite charity, which is the American Association, American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, which runs animal shelters across the country. So what they do is they take a salary, they take the same perks, and then they take the remaining profits and they divvy it up, and 50% go to the Sierra Club and 50% go to the ASPCA. Does this strike anybody as unethical? So people would be correct here in saying it's not, because once again, 100% of the shareholders of the company are agreed on this particular course of action so that nobody is being exploited. But let's make things a little more complicated. Let's assume now that Bo and Billy actually have cousins, Brady and Bradley. And Brady and Bradley inherited 48% of the stock that they have of the company from their mother, who had founded it with Bo and Billy's father. Bo and Billy own 52%. That gives them controlling shares of the company. They elect the directors themselves as the only two directors. They appoint themselves as the CEO and the COO. They take their salaries, they take their perks, and they continue to give 100% of the remaining profits of Widget Co. to the Sierra Club and to the ASPCA. Is this a problem? Okay, let's assume that Brady and Bradley do not agree, that they're very unhappy. What the corporate law would say, and what I think almost everybody would recognize, is at this point, this is an ethical problem. And the reason is, even though promoting the environment and promoting animal welfare are noble goals, these are goals of Bo and Billy as individuals. They're not goals of Widget Co. And in directing company assets to their personal goals, when 100% of the shareholders are not on board, this represents a waste of company assets. It can also represent a form of self-dealing. And so both corporate law would say that this is inappropriate, unethical behavior, and business ethics would also say that this is unethical, because what's happening is Bo and Billy are using their positions as the directors and the officers of Widget Co. to push the assets towards things that they think are worthwhile. And Brady and Bradley, who own 48% of the company, see no benefit from their ownership. They might have their own favorite charities. They might have their own needs. Perhaps they have special needs children, or perhaps they just simply want to enjoy the benefits of ownership themselves that they should be getting as shareholders of the company. So the lesson of this is made a bit more stark, but doesn't change in character if we make Widget Co. now a public company where the public at large owns 80% of the shares. And the overall lesson here, and it somewhat runs contrary to a lot of people's preferences and a lot of discourse on social media, is that the right thing for company directors, officers, employees relates to their duties, not their personal preferences, no matter how noble. And so the obligations of in some cases, the controlling shareholders, but certainly of the directors and of the officers of the company, its employees, is to seek the well-being of the company first and foremost. That has to be the ultimate goal of what they're doing in almost all US jurisdictions. It's not a question of their personal preferences. And so this is the same sense if you, for example, if you had a shepherd and the shepherd's job was to look after a flock, and the shepherd looked across the field and saw a few starving wolves and decided that, well, these wolves are beautiful creatures and they're noble and maybe they're even endangered or threatened. And the right thing to do is let's let the wolves have a couple of sheep so the wolves can survive and prosper. The fact is the shepherd's job is to guard the flock. And particularly if it's not his flock, he's not allowed just to decide to feed some wolves with it. So this is an important part of both American corporate law and also of business ethics generally, because what happens is, from an ethical standpoint, when you split the costs and benefits of an activity, so that when Bo and Billy take the benefits of the wealth by giving it to their favorite charity, they're basically imposing the cost on Brady, Bradley, and the other shareholders. Whenever you split from cost from benefit, it makes it impossible really to calculate what's called the overall utility of what you're doing. And that would violate cost-benefit ethics. In a similar vein, you can also argue that Bo and Billy are basically exploiting the minority shareholders. That would always violate a different formulation of ethics called Kantian or deontological ethics, which says that you should always act in accordance with a rule that you would want to see everybody to follow. And if Bo and Billy were minority shareholders in a company and somebody were giving that money away to purposes that they didn't agree with, they would feel exploited. So from both a corporate law perspective and a business ethics perspective, directors and officers and employees have to focus on the overall goal of the company, not their personal overall goal, nor their personal preferences, no matter how noble. That then leads us to the question of, okay, when something arises, when there's some social or political event, the company needs to say, and when I say the company, it's the people who run the company, the directors and the officers principally, have to say to themselves, do we need to do something? And here's a flow chart I would propose people think about. Does our company have a direct interest in this matter? Does this really concern us directly? And we'll explore this in a little bit. If yes, then do something. So for example, the government, the state government is contemplating an increase in the sales tax, and you're a retailer. You might have a view on that. You're in the construction industry and the government is thinking about a an infrastructure bill. Or it might be that a building has collapsed in Surfside, Florida, and you're an engineering firm and you're interested and you have an interest in whether the engineering standards are met. Then you might be entitled to do something because the company itself, not the people who run it as individuals, but the company itself have a direct interest in the matter. If the company doesn't have a direct interest in the matter, then you have to ask ourselves, does our company's mission, values, culture, and brand demand action? And this may in fact be the case. And if we think, we're going to talk about Target in a little bit, Target had a very, very progressive mission, value, culture, brand. That was part of what the company was about. So should it have done something in light of the North Carolina change in, or North Carolina law about use of government facilities? Bear in mind in this case that the law in North Carolina did not affect Target stores. It did not affect private retailers. It affected government buildings. So it wasn't a direct interest. However, the company might have felt that the law itself in some way impacted its mission, values, culture, and brand. If that happens, then you might want to do something. If it doesn't, then you have to say, will contributing our insight or resources in some way build goodwill? This goes to the question, do we really have something insightful to say about this particular issue? Well, it's somehow participating redound to our goodwill. And you have to be very careful in the context of crossfires, because very often in crossfires, the relevant group, the voting population at large, for example, might be pretty evenly split. And so you might say, well, we might improve our goodwill with some people, but we could really damage it with some others. So are we being honest with ourselves about whether this is going to build goodwill or not? Now, it's one thing to say, okay, we're going to contribute a modest amount of resources to some kind of relief program in different areas. But this is where you have to follow the logic of, do we have a direct interest really and truly? Our mission, values, culture, brand impacted? Will contributing insight in some way build goodwill? And so to follow that through, if yes, then you might want to do something. But if not, then you really shouldn't do anything. And in this respect, companies need to think, the people in the companies need to say to themselves, does direct really means direct? So you can formulate arguments about why certain activities directly affect you, because if we don't have a democratic society, then our economy is going to fall apart and our company is going to go bankrupt. And the question is that a reason or is that a rationale? And in many cases, I would say it's a rationale, because if companies really felt that way, they would be tracking some of this legislation from the get-go. As soon as the bill had been introduced in the legislature, it should have been tracked. When it was being discussed in front of committee, the company would have wanted to have testified or submitted comments or to have alerted its lobbyists and other public affairs people. So if you're going to make the argument that you in fact have a direct interest in the matter, then you have to say to yourselves, well, does our past behavior indicate that we've acted as if we really had a direct interest in the matter? Or has this just piqued our concern as individuals currently, and we're being tempted to use the company's name and resources for that purpose? That's a hard question to ask, but it has to be asked unless you're going to be a faithless shepherd. We talked about reasons versus rationalizations. Also around the idea of, do we need to do something? I think everyone on this call is familiar with the challenge of trying to develop a social capital strategy, trying to build up goodwill in the larger environment. This is not only to drive sales or to drive higher profitability, but people know that in the real world, there accidents happen, mishaps happen. There are going to be employees in any company, no matter how well run, who are going to make bad decisions, perhaps even break the law. And so having a coherent social capital strategy where your mission reinforces your values, reinforces your culture, reinforces your brand, reinforces your mission is essential, because what happens is when there's bad buzz out there, people might be more inclined to disbelieve the bad buzz and try to find out more, or they might say, okay, this company messed up, or some people within the company messed up, but the company in general tries to do a lot of good, and they actually do a lot of good. And therefore, I'm going to weigh this into larger perspective. Here's some tactical do's and don'ts when you're trying to answer the question, do we need to do something? So this is an expert group, so let's just be comparing our notes, and please use the chat feature to let me know if how you agree or disagree, or how you would want to add to this. Tactical do's and don'ts. One is you want to try to raise the issue to a level of agreement. This is something our previous two presidents both used quite a lot. So love Trump or hate him, what you can notice from one of his communications techniques was he would raise things to a level of agreement in this respect. He gets a question about environmental policy of his administration, and he says, I'm the world's biggest environmentalist. I want the cleanest water. I want the purest air. I want the greenest forests. So what he's done is he's taken whatever issue the reporter wants to discuss, and he's put it up to a level to say, hey, I'm on your side. President Obama would do the same thing. He would tend to stand in the middle and say, there are people on this side who say X, there are people on the other side who say Y. We need to figure out what the right balancing of X and Y would be. So again, he would raise things up to the level of agreement. In the voting rights area, for example, a company that felt that it had to do something in terms of making a statement might say that both voting access and voting integrity are essential to the functioning of a democracy. So you take things up to a level of agreement. You also would often use the feel, felt, found formula. This is something President Obama was a master at, saying, many people feel this way. I myself felt this way in this regard, but here's what I found, and here's how it affected what I currently feel. Again, the technique is to put oneself on the side of someone who might otherwise be opposing or criticizing you. And rather than telling them wrong, encouraging them to follow you on the trek of discovery that you've gone through to come up to the position you currently hold. Don't ever lie. And I think most people on the call have probably experienced this. If you're caught in a lie, it completely destroys your credibility. And it becomes the issue, and trying to recover is nearly impossible. Also bear in mind that in the modern age, there are people whose both vocations and avocations rest in making you look bad. And what you do by lying when you're caught out in a lie is now you allow people to mix some truth with falsehoods, and that makes for a very potent cocktail. If we take a classic case of the Ford Pinto, at the time of the Ford Pinto, when it was accused of selling a defective car that had a tendency to explode after being, or to burn after being rear-ended and incinerating its passengers, Ford was also found to have cheated on EPA emissions tests for its autos. That specific nugget of wrongdoing, which was not related to the gas tank, created an environment or allowed Ford's critics to mix a cocktail of some nasty truth with what might have been some misinformation, but it made for very, very potent poison to Ford's reputation. Finally, as people know, leave room for updated facts and changed circumstances. A lot of the information you get in a crisis initially or in a crossfire is going to be wrong, incomplete, or else it goes out of date very quickly. And therefore, in formulating your public positions and your statements, you have to anticipate what's been called the fog of war, and to always leave yourself room for amendment to say, based on our current understanding of the situation, X, or our company is committed to the following. We try to do our best, utmost in all this, and we will look into this matter in greater detail to make sure that things were handled well, or that they will be corrected as soon as we can correct them. So avoid hard statements that could come back to bite you and make you look like a liar, because once you look like a liar, it's going to be very, very hard to recover your personal credibility and to recover your company's reputation. Let's go to the next question, which is, have we followed the right procedure? So we've tried to decide, do we need to do something? And obviously, if we decide not to do something, that's pretty easy. Sometimes the something is just, we're going to issue a statement where we are taking the issue to the level of agreement, and we're going to leave it at that because we really don't have particular expertise or insight in this area. And pretending to have more insight than we do, or taking a side in a highly contentious area, is not in the best interest of the company. We might have personal opinions, which we as citizens are not only entitled to express, but may have an obligation to express. So have we followed the right procedures? Let's talk a little bit about corporate governance just to try to answer the question. The highest decision-making body in a company is the meeting of shareholders. Or in a limited liability company, it's the general meeting of unit holders or the general assembly. It's basically the owners of the company. They only take very, very fundamental decisions like approving a major action that would for example, merge the company, sell all or substantially all of the assets of the company outside the ordinary course of business, or in some cases, fundamentally change the nature of the company. So for example, if you have a Delaware company and it's focused on maximizing shareholder value, and you want to turn it into a public benefit corporation that will pursue both shareholder maximization of wealth and some public benefit, you'll need to get the approval of the meeting of shareholders and change your articles of incorporation. The meeting of shareholders also importantly elects the board of directors. The board of directors appoints, guides, and supervises the senior management. It sets policy, it oversees the formulation of strategy, and increasingly in the corporate law or the federal statutes governing corporations and similar businesses, the board of directors has some direct oversight over certain systems like financial reporting, risk management, whatnot. But the other factor of the board is it will appoint the management, and the managers will actually manage the government. So it's important to follow the right procedures for several reasons. One is we have obligations as good shepherds to make sure that we respect the rights and duties of other people within the organization. The other fact, quite honestly, is we're human beings, and human beings are very good at rationalizing their behavior. They're good at convincing themselves that something is unassailably correct when maybe it's their view or the view of those immediately around them. And so to help make sure that the decision being taken is really the decision of the company and not the decision of a few people within the company, you have to make sure you follow the proper procedures. In this, I distinguish among a pose, a principle, and a policy. A pose is something you do because you think it makes you look good and probably isn't going to cost you anything. A principle is some stand you take that could actually cost you or cost your company some value. And then there are policies, and policies are things that have to be implemented. They require thought, they require care, they require planning. So you can take a pose or a principle, but if you want to make it a policy, then you have to make sure that the issue has been operationally thought through. So let's think through some concrete examples. About a couple of years ago, the Business Roundtable, which is an association comprising over 180 global CEOs, adopted a new resolution. And according to the headline, it changed the purpose of a company or corporation from maximizing the wealth of the shareholders to creating and promoting an economy that serves all Americans. And there was a great hullabaloo about this, and there was a big press release, and a lot of press picked this up, and they treated it as if some major milestone had been reached and some large turn had been made in how companies were going to be run in the future. Well, something to bear in mind is if you're really moving from a model of our goal as the company is to maximize shareholder wealth to our goal as the company is to benefit all of our stakeholders in addition to our shareholders. A stakeholder being, for example, your employees, your suppliers, your customers, the community in which you operate. Several things happen. That's a large policy shift. And so a Harvard Law professor took a look at this and said, well, how many of these CEOs before they signed this particular resolution actually got the approval of its board of directors? And the answer, according to the research, was, well, one CEO in 180 actually did that. And that might indicate to you that was this really a change in policy? Because it never went through the chief policymaking body of the company, which is the board of directors. And when you actually drill into the language of the resolution, what you see is that you can read the resolution to either support maximization of shareholder wealth or benefit all stakeholders. So the fact is there was some strategic ambiguity in how this thing was drafted. And finally, you'd say, well, if the resolution really wanted to switch the purpose of a corporation to creating wealth or to benefiting all of its stakeholders, these are global companies. So why in the world would a global company want to say that it's trying to promote an economy that serves all Americans? Wouldn't it try to create an economy that serves everybody in the world? So what you can see from this is there's a very good case to be made that this was actually not about taking any real stand. It was about reducing these CEOs' target silhouette or signature vis-a-vis critics who wanted to push stakeholder theory. And I'm not asking you to reject or accept stakeholder theory or accept or reject profit or wealth maximization for shareholders. I'm asking you to look in this case and say, hey, this resolution appears to be deceptive. And under golden rule ethics, any effort to deceive is unethical. So this does not appear to have been a pretty good case of following the right procedures. And by drilling into the right procedures, such as getting the board approval, you would have been able to unearth whether or not this was a sincere exercise or not. Let's look at a couple other examples. So I think people are familiar with Colin Kaepernick. He's a former NFL quarterback. A few years ago, while he was playing for the San Francisco 49ers, he decided that he would kneel during the playing of the national anthem in order to protest the plight of minorities and the misbehavior of police. His kneeling at the time was unpopular among some people, and it was popular among others. And what the CEO of Nike decided to do was he was going to feature Colin Kaepernick in a global marketing campaign. Now, what did the CEO of Nike do? He could probably guess that there might be some people who would love this and there might be some people who would hate it. So he wasn't trying to burnish the reputation among all people for Nike. What he did do was he went to the board of directors and he said, this is what I'm planning to do. And they said, go ahead. So insofar as this was a marketing effort designed to improve sales of Nike products among a particular part of consumer groups, he went through the board. And if this were a case of taking a political stand, he at least went through the board. So he went through he got the permission from the leading policy body within the company. It doesn't mean the directors were right, but it means that he as a CEO, I think, at least did the right thing. Contrast that to the CEO of Expensify. Expensify is a cloud-based software platform for managing your business expenses. The CEO of Expensify, prior to the 2020 presidential election, used the assets of the company and used the customer lists of the company to send out a political endorsement of a particular candidate for president. So he was using company resources. He did not get board approval. He did not go through his board. He was not the sole owner of this company. And I think that that was wrong from a corporate governance standpoint. And I think it was wrong from a corporate ethics standpoint because it's not his company. He works for it, and his duties are to seek the well-being of the company, not his personal preferences. And he has to put a check on his own inclinations by going through the right procedures to make sure that he's not just acting on his own point of view, and that it would be the company's point of view, and that requires action by more than just the CEO. The other thing I would note is that it's quite possible that in using the customer lists for these purposes, he might have violated privacy law. Because typically when you give your personal data to a company like this, you're giving it for business purposes. And therefore, if this did not constitute a proper business purpose, then someone whose data might have been used for this might claim that this is a violation of privacy law. EU privacy law is very strict, but more recently, California privacy law has also gotten very strict. And this is part of the problem. The issue is you don't just need to go upstairs if you're the CEO and check on a policy level with your board to make sure that they will bless this either as something that helps maximize shareholder wealth or represents a position of the company per se. You have to go down to your direct reports and say, this is what we're thinking of doing. How should we accomplish this? And it would probably be, if you ask that question among your general counsel, your privacy officer, your operations officer, somebody would have raised privacy law concerns. And there might be some other concerns involved in this. Or they might have said, here's the amount of money it's going to cost us just simply to do this, the out-of-pocket money. So that's why you have to follow the right procedures. You have to make sure that you're not just taking a pose that violates your duties as an officer or a fiduciary of the company. You have to understand if this is a company's decision, that it's a principled one, and that the policies have been thought through so that people understand, are we implementing this in the right way? This gets to the larger point, which is needing to do something doesn't justify doing anything. And so while your first inclination might be to do something, and you might think this through and say, well, you know what, on balance, you really do need to do something for the reasons that we talked about in the flow chart. You'd say, well, what is it we should do? And that's another question. It's important one to ask. And that's why you have to think through the policies. And that involves the right governance procedures. You then have to ask, when you're contemplating action or inaction, what precedent will we set? So let's look at one pretty recent example. McKinsey & Company is the world's premier consulting firm. They have been known as the Jesuits of capitalism. They're the 600-pound gorillas of consulting. And for several years, they were advising opioid makers on how to market and distribute more opioids, particularly OxyContin. McKinsey suffered greatly from its advising, particularly Purdue Pharmaceuticals, because of the human cost of opioid addiction and overprescription. Now, McKinsey wasn't the only one involved in this issue. And at the time McKinsey was operating, it broke no laws, and the drugs were legal to prescribe. So there's a lot more going on in this whole opioid and fiasco and crisis than involving just McKinsey. McKinsey's response was to create a new client service policy. One thing it said is, we're no longer representing opioid manufacturers or distributors. And that might have been the right decision, but the next question is, well, you know, opioids kill a lot of people every year, but so does fast food, so does tobacco, so does alcohol. So if we're going to say no more opioid representation, when that was a lawful work for something that was distributed lawfully with a prescription, where are you going to draw the line? Can't represent McDonald's anymore? Can't represent sugar, Coca-Cola, for example? Because those also create morbidities that might be as severe in the aggregate or more so than the opioids. So in trying to wrestle with this, McKinsey came up with a new client service policy. And part of what it said, in addition to no more opioids, was it created a centralized committee that was going to vet client engagements for reputational risk of this kind. In addition, it drew a line and said, countries who don't score at a certain level for democratic operation, for democratic rule of law, we're not going to represent any of the power ministries. So for example, the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of the Interior, or the Ministry of Justice. Those are just completely out. Now, what I would say is, when you have a bright line policy like this, when I was working for Tony Blair in Central Asia, I was advising a Ministry of Justice on how to improve the collection of civil awards. And so what would happen is, a woman might get divorced and her husband might not pay alimony, and she would have trouble collecting the award. There might be children from the marriage, and the woman might be entitled to child support, and the husband wasn't paying child support. So I felt actually very good in that particular content, saying I am helping a lot of very normal people get justice, and that this is an area where it's appropriate and very helpful for me to help this country improve the collection of civil awards. So that might be completely out of bounds under the new policy. The other thing to bear in mind was that McKinsey traditionally had delegated tremendous discretion to its partners. That part of its company culture was to give the individual partners a lot of discretion in terms of what kinds of projects, what kind of studies that it would take, what client engagements it would be willing to work on. The flip side of that is McKinsey held the partners' feet to the fire that they really had to generate a lot of new business. And so in addition to the new client service policy, McKinsey also paid $573 million in settlement to about 48 states' attorney generals to settle any claims arising from its advising the opioid manufacturer. The settlement also noted McKinsey's being a good corporate citizen, that McKinsey's work was lawful, et cetera. Basically, McKinsey made a business call, I think, which said, look, if we have to litigate this in 48 states, our legal fees are going to exceed $573 million. And if we lose a few of these in front of juries, it could crush our firm. So this is an owner-operated business, and they made a calculated business decision. And they also probably figured, look, what's it going to do to our reputation going forward? And what's it going to do to our business selling services to state governments if we're in litigation with these state governments over the opioid claims? So McKinsey settled. And part of the fallout from this is if the CEO, Snyder, was not reelected, which is highly unusual. Typically, McKinsey CEOs, they serve for a 3-year term and they're up for reelection once. It used to be twice. It's highly unusual for a CEO not to get reelected. In this particular case, Snyder was not the CEO when most of the opioid advisory work was going on. Snyder was the CEO when the new policy came in place and when the settlement was issued. So I think what you can see is the partnership itself expressing its displeasure with some of these new policies coming in. On a smaller case, I was involved with a charity that decided in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder that it would donate a certain amount of money to a charity that supported justice, social justice in the African-American community. And what happened a few months later was an Asian American was beaten and abused. And one of the Asian American members of this association came and said, we need to give an equal amount of money that we gave previously to an Asian American social justice organization. And when the leadership of the association hesitated, because what happened was they could start multiplying the amount of donations by the number of potential groups that might claim a donation, they realized that they would quickly blow through all of their money. And so they had a very acrimonious, ugly, and accusatory series of conversations, because they realized that in making the first contribution that they had signaled perhaps a precedent which would lead to many more contributions, well beyond the capability of the organization to pay, but also starting to get well beyond the purpose of the association. So this is where you really have to think through, if you don't do something, you do something, what precedent are we setting? And you have to think about that as you give your rationale for the behavior. Final question, I think, is should we go it alone? And here we're going to look at Target in a couple of ways. Way back in 2010, there was a race for the governorship of the state of Minnesota, where Target's parent company is located. One of the candidates running for office wanted to reduce the state sales tax, in which Target had a direct interest as a retailer. So Target gave money to an organization that was supporting that person's campaign. A tertiary issue, not on the landing page, but in several pages deep, that same candidate supported traditional marriage. And so when it came to light that Target had given money to this candidate, some people who supported gay marriage were very upset. And they launched a boycott effort. And what initially Target issued a letter and then issued a retraction and an apology on the letter and promised to set up a committee, and decided to make its donations through a retailers association in the future to have an extra layer of insulation between its giving money and the other policies of candidates who were involved in issues relevant to the retail business. Now, bear in mind that back in 2010, when Target gave this donation, in the 2008 presidential election, basically all the major candidates, including candidate Obama and including candidate Clinton and including the Republican candidates, all favored traditional marriage and all opposed gay marriage. So we're looking at a donation that was made relatively shortly in the aftermath of those behaviors. So the behavior might seem odd to us today, or the policy position might seem less acceptable to us today, but you have to also weigh the policy decision and the countervailing factors at the time. So I think that Target found itself blindsided because it thought as a retailer, it was just giving money to someone whose principal issue as a candidate in economic matters was a reduction in the state sales tax. So what happened? Well, a few years later, the state of North Carolina decided that it would pass a law prohibiting, or I would say requiring people in government buildings to use the lavatory aligned with their sex, either at birth or what was written on their state identification documents. And I think Target decided that it would get ahead of this particular issue. And so what it did was it set out a policy for Target stores nationwide that said that Target patrons could use the lavatory and the changing room that aligned with their gender identification at the time. As a result of which, you can see what happened with the stock price, and particularly compared to its competitors. Now, I have not done a formal regression analysis to isolate the issue of the Target policy, but you can see at least initially that there's a large scissors opening up from this policy. And so what we'd find when you look at what happened was Target did not go through proper procedures. The CEO was not even consulted before this particular policy was issued. So bear in mind, of course, Target has a very progressive mission, values, culture brand. So when you ask the question, should we go it alone? You know, the reality is that a universal feeling, whether well or ill-founded, cannot be safely disregarded. And companies have to think about, well, do we want to get so far out in front of the herd that we're going to get culled and killed by our predators? We also don't want to be so far behind the herd that we're going to be culled and killed by our predators. So what should Target have done? Well, let's take a look in the area of privacy, where I think the Federal Trade Commission did a great job. In the earliest part of the century, behavioral advertising and online targeting were becoming quite popular, but the ethics of the targeting hadn't been worked out. And there was a wide range of opinion as to what extent individually targeted ads were appropriate, were ethical, whether they should be legal, et cetera. So what the Federal Trade Commission did is it ran a series of town halls. And anybody who wanted could come to the town hall, and everyone who wanted could have his or her say. In addition, the Federal Trade Commission solicited comments online. So several dozen organizations submitted comments in writing as to what the rules should be, how people should think about it. And finally, the FTC issued a staff report on principles of behavioral advertising. The principles were not obligatory. They were prescriptive, saying this is what we think we should do. Now, what did this process do? It did several things. It got everybody in the same room talking to each other who wanted to be there. So in that respect, it created a commonality. It created some common definitions, so people at least had a sense of what are we talking about when we mean personally identifiable information? What do we mean when we talk about sensitive information? So it created common definitions. Where possible, it found common ground. And in some cases, it at least tried to refine and define the areas of disagreement. And then finally, it set out areas for further study. This had real bite, right? This wasn't just talking, it had real bite, because one is it affected the conversation. It reached some consensus on certain points. Also, what happened was companies that said that they would abide by the principles were now bound by that, because if they violated the principles, the FTC could come after them for a deceptive or unfair trade practice. So my own view is that in deciding the rules we have to live by, persuasion is better than force, particularly in relatively newer, fast-moving areas where you tend to find social crossfires. This is how Churchill phrased it. I think President Johnson put it a bit more homely fashion. So what I think that Target should have done is I think Target would have been acting consistently with its mission, values, culture, and brand if it said, look, North Carolina has come out with this law. A lot of people like it. A lot of people don't like it. The fact is this issue is now going to flow down into private companies. We think that we call upon the National Retailers Association to start holding a series of town halls to discuss what the position of private real estate operators, what retailers should be in terms of bathroom policies. What would it have done? Well, Target would not have gotten so far out in front of the issue that it would have become a target for its enemies. In addition, what it would have done is it would have allowed people, even those who disagree with it, to have a voice to talk through these important issues. And Target could have taken a progressive role in the discussions, but it would have done so within the context of the larger policy dialogue. So Target would have been acting consistently with its mission, values, culture, and brand, but it would have been finding a format that was less likely to isolate it and punish it. But at the end of the day, it might also have resulted in a better outcome in terms of more change in the direction that it wanted. What companies should be thinking about then are on these areas of social format is, what are we implementing? What are we defining? And what are we anticipating? So it's important to look out into the future and say, where do we think these things are going and how do we prepare? To wrap up, what I would note is there is a market for reputation out there. It is vicious. It is often zero sum. And that organizations will find that there are lots of people whose vocations or avocations are dedicated to making you look bad. So I encourage you to think about the issues that we discussed today. I'm happy to take any questions. If you want a copy of the presentation, feel free to get in touch with me via LinkedIn, send me a LinkedIn invitation, and I'd be happy to send you the document and answer any further questions. So thank you very much for your time and attention. I wish everybody a good day. Back to you,
Thank you,
Brian.
Robert. Anybody that has any questions, you can put them. We got just a couple minutes here. You can stick them in the chat box, or if you're watching us on Facebook, put them in as a comment there. Otherwise, those of you that have been in attendance today and taken part, we're going to get you an electronic copy of Robert's book. Look for that via email here in the next couple of weeks. And Robert, again, really appreciate you coming out here. This was a really great presentation and very topical, because those of us in PRSA St. Louis, we are the marketing and communications and public relations professionals of the organizations we serve. And so having some forethought into how should our organization, how should me as the representative of my organization, how should we be addressing and dealing with social and political controversies. This is very timely and very good information, and maybe something that a lot of people don't think about in advance. They don't really think about it until that fire starts. So it's good to see a presentation like this and give it a little bit of forethought.
Thank you.
So again, thank you everybody for attending. Thank you, Robert, again for being here with us. This is great. And like I said, be on the lookout for an email with an e-version of Robert's book. Thanks.